This isn't a story I tell at dinner parties. This is something that happened to me, a quiet series of events that dismantled my entire world and then taught me how to rebuild it from the ashes. The polished mahogany of the conference table felt as cold as a tombstone under my fingertips. It was the centerpiece of a sterile, soundproof room on the 47th floor of a skyscraper in downtown Chicago, a place where marriages came to die under fluorescent lights. Across from me sat my husband of 15 years, Marcus, looking impeccably bored in a Tom Ford suit, flanked by his lawyer, a man named Donovan who had the soul of a barracuda stuffed into a human-sized vessel. Donovan slid a leather-bound folder toward my own attorney with a theatrical sigh of finality. "My client, Mr. Reed," he announced, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "has provided a complete and transparent disclosure of all marital assets, as is required by the state of Illinois." The lie was so bald, so utterly shameless, it sucked the air right out of the room. I watched Marcus's lips twitch into the faintest smirk as I placed my own, much thinner manila folder directly on top of his. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The end didn't begin in that lawyer's office. It began 3 months earlier, over a 24-ounce bone-in ribeye at Gibson's Barn Steakhouse on Rush Street. It was our spot, the place we'd celebrated every anniversary, every promotion, every milestone since we were two ambitious kids fresh out of Northwestern. He'd summoned me there on a Tuesday night with a curt text. "We need to talk. Gibson's, 8 p.m. I'd spent an hour getting ready, thinking it was a surprise, maybe an early anniversary celebration. I chose a blue silk dress he'd always loved, the fabric whispering against my skin like a promise. But when I arrived, there were no flowers, no champagne, just Marcus, staring into a glass of Macallan 25 with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but a profound and chilling indifference. He didn't even stand up when I sat down. He just gestured for the waiter to bring me a glass of wine and then dropped the bomb between the bread service and the appetizer. "I want a divorce, Amy," he said, his voice as calm and steady as if he were ordering another drink. "I've met someone. Her name is Tabitha. She's an associate at the firm. I'm in love with her." The words didn't register at first. They felt like a foreign language, sounds without meaning. I just stared at him, at the perfect knot of his tie, the faint lines around his eyes that I used to trace with my fingertips, and felt a ringing in my ears. 15 years. I had given up my career as a forensic accountant, a job I was not just good at, but brilliant at, to be the perfect corporate wife. I'd raised our 2 children, managed our homes in Lincoln Park and Lake Geneva, and curated a social life that was the bedrock of his networking. I was the silent partner in the empire of Marcus Reed, the architect of the life that allowed him to become a titan of private equity. And he was ending it, for a Tabitha. "I've already had the papers drawn up," he continued, pushing a folder across the table, the same way his lawyer would months later. "I'm being more than generous. There's a lump sum, the house in Lake Geneva is yours, and of course full child support. It's more than fair." I opened the folder, my hands trembling. The numbers inside were an insult. They represented maybe 5% of what I knew we were worth. It was severance pay, a golden handshake for a fired employee. "Marcus, this is—" I couldn't finish the sentence. He cut me off, his voice laced with a condescending patience that was far crueler than rage. "Amy, look. My finances are complex. You wouldn't understand the structures, the LLCs, the trusts. This is a simple, clean number. It avoids messiness. It's better for everyone, especially the kids, if we just sign and move on. You wouldn't understand." The 4 words echoed in my head. I, who had graduated top of my class with a degree in accounting. I, who had once been on the fast track to partner at Deloitte, for my ability to sniff out financial rot in the most complex corporate structures. He had forgotten who I was, or more accurately, he was counting on me having forgotten who I was. I looked up from the papers, my vision blurring with unshed tears, and saw it in his eyes, pity. He saw me as a relic, a comfortable domestic creature he had outgrown, the beautiful, supportive wife who had played her part and was now being gracefully ushered off stage. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Just sign it, Amy. Don't make this ugly. You don't have the stomach for it." That was when the grief curdling in my stomach began to harden into something else, something cold and sharp and heavy, It was resolve. The first few weeks were a blur of tears and sleepless nights, punctuated by the well-meaning but useless platitudes of my friends. Marcus had already moved into a sleek rental at the St. Regis, plastering his new life with Tabitha all over social media. They were at galas, on yachts, vacationing in St. Bart's, and with every glossy photo, the message was clear. He had upgraded. I was the discarded past. I let myself grieve for exactly 14 days. On the 15th day, I woke up before dawn, made a pot of coffee so strong it could dissolve steel, and went into the one room in our Lincoln Park brownstone that Marcus had always considered exclusively his, the home office. It was a monument to his ego, all dark wood, leather, and plaques commemorating his financial conquests. He'd taken his personal laptop, of course, but he'd left the rest. The desktop computer, the filing cabinets, the shelves of leather-bound books that were more for decoration than reading. He was so confident in my ignorance, so certain I would just crumble and accept his pittance, that he hadn't bothered to be careful. He hadn't bothered to hide a thing, because he believed I wouldn't even know where to look. I sat down in his $1,000 ergonomic chair, the leather sighing under my weight, and I began to dig. I wasn't his wife anymore. I was a forensic accountant on the most important audit of her life. I started with the basics: bank statements, credit card bills, investment summaries he'd left in his desk drawer. Everything on the surface matched the disclosure documents he'd given me at the restaurant. It was a perfect, pristine picture of a wealthy but not obscenely wealthy man. The numbers were clean. Too clean. It was like a crime scene where the killer had scrubbed the floors with bleach. The very perfection of it was a red flag. For 3 days, I found nothing. I cross-referenced every transaction, every wire transfer, every stock sale. It was a fortress of financial planning, designed by the best accountants and lawyers money could buy. I started to feel a flicker of doubt. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was in over my head. Maybe I should just take the deal and try to salvage what was left of my life. I was about to give up, ready to drown my sorrows in a bottle of Chardonnay, when my eyes landed on a row of identical leather-bound classics on the top shelf. Marcus loved the look of intellectualism. Moby Dick, The Great Gatsby, War and Peace. He'd never read any of them. Tucked among them was a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch. It was a strange choice for him, a dense Victorian novel about provincial life. But it had been a gift from me years ago. I had inscribed it on the inside cover, "For my brilliant husband who builds worlds. Love, Amy." It was his favorite of all the decorative books, he'd once said, because it made him look thoughtful. My fingers brushed against the spine, and I felt a slight irregularity. A small ridge that shouldn't have been there. My heart started to beat a little faster. I pulled the book from the shelf. It was heavier than it should be. I opened it and my breath caught in my throat. The center of the book had been hollowed out, a perfect rectangular cavity carved into the pages. And nestled inside was a tiny, sleek black USB drive. No label, no markings, just a small, anonymous piece of plastic and metal. It was so cliché it was almost laughable, the kind of thing you see in a spy movie. But as I held it in the palm of my hand, it felt like a key, or a weapon. I plugged it into the desktop. The drive was encrypted with a level of security I'd never seen before. It demanded a password, a long alphanumeric string. I tried everything I could think of: our anniversary, our children's birthdays, the name of his first dog, the ticker symbol of his first major stock win. Nothing. Each failed attempt was met with a cold digital rejection. I spent the next week like a ghost haunting my own home, grabbing snatches of sleep on the office couch, fueled by caffeine and a growing obsessive rage. I downloaded decryption software, watched tutorials on ethical hacking, and relearned skills I hadn't used in nearly 2 decades. I was at war with a single password field. Marcus, meanwhile, was turning the screws. He'd had my credit cards canceled, claiming unusual activity. He'd frozen our main joint checking account, leaving me with just the small household account I used for groceries. His message was clear: surrender. You can't afford this fight. He was trying to starve me out, to break my will. And it was almost working. The morning I finally broke through, I was on my last nerve. I was staring at the password prompt, my eyes burning with exhaustion, when I thought about the book again. Middlemarch. Why that book? And then it hit me. The inscription. For my brilliant husband, who builds worlds. It wasn't about the book. It was about his ego. His password wouldn't be something sentimental about us. It would be something about him. I thought about his favorite quote, the one he had framed on his wall, the one he'd drunkenly recite at dinner parties to impress his friends. It was from Napoleon Bonaparte. With trembling fingers, I typed it in, no spaces, all lowercase, with his birth year at the end. Impossible is a word to be found only in Thedi, Scenario of Fools 1978. The screen flickered. The password prompt vanished, and a single folder appeared on the screen. It was labeled simply, Contingency. My hand hovered over the mouse, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Whatever was in that folder, I knew it would change everything. I clicked open the Contingency folder, and my world tilted on its axis. It wasn't just a simple spreadsheet or a few hidden bank statements. It was an entire shadow life, a meticulously documented financial universe running parallel to the one I knew. There were subfolders labeled with cryptic names: Cayman Project, Zurich Holdings, Project Nightingale. Inside were scanned bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, and encrypted email chains. It wasn't one offshore account. It was a constellation of them, a sophisticated network of shell corporations designed to make millions of dollars disappear. I started with the Cayman account. It held $12 million. The Zurich account held another 8. There was an entity in Liechtenstein holding deeds to properties I never knew existed: a ski chalet in Aspen, a beachfront villa in Turks and Caicos. All told, I counted over $35 million in hidden assets. Money he had systematically siphoned off from his company and our joint investments for the better part of a decade. He hadn't just been planning to leave me. He'd been planning to erase me from his financial life, to leave me with the scraps while he ascended to a new stratosphere of wealth with his new, younger model. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of fraud. Every time he'd told me a bonus was smaller than expected, or that a deal had fallen through, or that we needed to tighten our belts for a quarter, it had been a lie. A lie to fund this secret empire. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to grip the sides of the desk. Every shared dream, every sacrifice I had made, felt like a sham. I had been his partner in life, but a mark in his business. The wife who kept the home fires burning while he was out robbing the bank. But as I delved deeper into the files, my shock curdled into icy horror. There was one subfolder, buried 3 layers deep, with a name that made no sense: Vantage Point. It wasn't about hidden money. It contained audio files and a password-protected document. The audio files were recordings of phone calls. I clicked on the first one, my heart pounding against my ribs. I heard Marcus's voice, but it was different. Colder, more reptilian. He was talking to his business partner, a man named Richard Thorne. They were discussing a major real estate development deal they'd closed a few years prior, a deal that had made them both famous in the Chicago business community. They'd acquired a series of low-income housing blocks in Pilsen, promising the city they would build affordable, mixed-use developments. They had received massive tax incentives and public support. "The geological surveys are a problem," Richard said on the recording, his voice tinny and anxious. "The ground is unstable. The engineering firm says we need to sink an extra $10 million into foundational supports, or the entire structure could be compromised within a decade." Marcus's reply was smooth, utterly devoid of concern. "The geological surveys will say what we need them to say. I've already spoken to a man at a different firm. For a modest consulting fee, he's prepared to provide a more favorable report. We bury the original survey. We build on schedule, flip the commercial units for a massive profit, and we're out before anyone knows any better. By the time the cracks start to show, we'll be long gone." I felt the blood drain from my face. They hadn't just hidden money. They had knowingly and willfully built a series of buildings on unstable land, falsifying engineering reports to do so. They had put hundreds of lives at risk, families, children, all to save $10 million on a project that netted them nearly $100 million in profit. The password-protected document in the folder was the original damning geological survey. The proof of their crime. This changed the stakes entirely. This wasn't a divorce anymore. It was a federal crime. RICO statutes, mail fraud, conspiracy. Marcus wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a monster. In that moment, sitting in the pre-dawn stillness of his office, surrounded by the architecture of his deceit, something inside me shifted permanently. The hurt, vulnerable woman who had cried for 2 weeks was gone. In her place was a cold, calculating fury. He had called my life's work, our family, our home, a liability on his balance sheet. He had looked at me and seen a problem to be managed. He had underestimated me at every turn. He thought I wouldn't understand the finances. He thought I wouldn't have the stomach for a fight. He thought he could bury his crimes just as easily as he had buried that engineering report. A strange, chilling calm washed over me. I wasn't going to just fight for a fair settlement. I wasn't going to expose him to get my half. That was too small, too petty. I was going to dismantle his entire world. I was going to take everything from him: his money, his reputation, his freedom. He had built his empire on a foundation of lies, and I was going to be the earthquake that brought it all crashing down. I copied the entire contents of the USB drive onto a new encrypted hard drive of my own. Then I deleted the files from his drive, ran a scrubbing program to erase any trace of its contents, and placed the now empty USB back into the hollowed-out copy of Middlemarch. I placed the book back on the shelf, exactly where I had found it. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for him to walk into it. He had shown me his real face. Now he was about to see mine. He had forgotten I was a hunter of numbers, a tracker of secrets. And I had his scent. The war had begun. The first rule of forensic accounting is that you never use illegally obtained evidence directly. The USB drive was my roadmap, but it was inadmissible in court. If I presented it, Marcus's lawyers would tear me apart. They'd claim I fabricated it, stole it, violated his privacy. It would become a he said, she said, and the man with the 9-figure net worth almost always wins those arguments. I needed to find a way to get the same information through legal, verifiable channels. I needed to build my own case, brick by brick, using his secret knowledge as my guide. My first call was to a name I hadn't spoken in 15 years, Ben Carter. Ben and I had started at Deloitte together. He was a caffeine-addicted workaholic with an almost supernatural talent for data analysis. While I had left to raise a family, he had stayed, eventually leaving the corporate world to start his own boutique private investigation firm in the West Loop, specializing in high-stakes financial fraud. I met him at a Greasy Spoon diner in River North, a place so old school it still had vinyl booths and jukeboxes. Ben looked older, grayer, but his eyes had the same restless, analytical spark I remembered. I laid out the situation, careful to omit any mention of the USB drive. I simply said I believed my husband was hiding significant assets offshore and engaged in questionable business practices. "I can't afford your usual rates, Ben," I admitted, stirring my coffee. "He's cut me off financially, but I can offer you a percentage of whatever undisclosed assets you find." "A big percentage." Ben listened intently, his gaze sharp. "Amy, you know how this goes. These guys, they're ghosts. They hire the best firms in the world to make their money untraceable." "I know," I said, leaning forward. "But I have a few leads. Possible locations, names." I gave him the 2 locations from the USB drive, the Cayman Islands and Zurich. And I gave him one name, a name I'd pulled from an email header on Marcus's drive: Jean-Luc Dubois, a private banker at a prestigious firm in Geneva. I told Ben that Marcus had mentioned this banker in passing once, a lie I'd rehearsed until it sounded natural. It was just enough to give him a thread to pull. "It's a needle in a haystack, Amy," Ben warned. "A very expensive haystack." "I know," I said, sliding a cashier's check across the table. It was for $25,000. I'd sold a diamond necklace Marcus had given me for our 10th anniversary. "That's the retainer. Find the needle." While Ben's team started their slow, methodical work of chasing international banking records and corporate filings, I turned my attention to Vantage Point. Proving criminal fraud was a much more dangerous game. A direct accusation would be dismissed. I needed to plant a seed. I remembered a young, hungry investigative reporter at the Chicago Tribune, a guy named David Chen, who had written a scathing piece on a corrupt city alderman a year prior. He was ambitious and wasn't afraid to take on powerful people. I created a burner email account at a public library in a different neighborhood. From that anonymous account, I sent a single email to David Chen. The subject line was, "Tip, the Pilsen Miracle Development." The body of the email was short and cryptic. Marcus Reed and Richard Thorne's Pilsen development isn't the miracle the city thinks it is. They cut corners. Dangerous ones. Look into their geological surveys. Specifically, look for a report from Geostability Inc. that they buried. Ask them why they switched to a lesser-known firm, Foundation Analytics, at the last minute. Something is rotten under those buildings. I attached no documents. I gave no name. It was just a crumb, a tiny morsel of information that would either be ignored or would ignite the curiosity of a born journalist. I had to trust that Chen's instincts would do the rest. Days turned into weeks. Marcus's legal team was applying immense pressure, filing motions to compel me to accept the settlement. Donovan, his lawyer, would call my own attorney daily, alternating between threats and condescending offers of a slightly increased nuisance value payout. They were treating me like a gnat to be swatted away. I lived on coffee and adrenaline, barely sleeping, my mind constantly racing, replaying scenarios, looking for holes in my strategy. The loneliness was crushing. My children were with my sister in Evanston, shielded from the ugliness, but I missed them with a physical ache. I was completely isolated in this fight, a general with an army of one. One evening, Ben called. "We got a hit," he said, his voice flat but carrying an undercurrent of excitement. It wasn't easy. We had to go through a shell corporation registered in Panama that owns another shell in Delaware, but we found it. A holding company, Nightingale Equity, is the primary beneficiary of a portfolio managed by the Swiss bank you mentioned. And the sole signatory on that account is Marcus Reed. My knees felt weak with relief. I sank into a chair. "How much is in it?" "We can't see the balance from here," Ben said. "Swiss banking laws are a fortress, but the account's activity profile suggests it's substantial. We're talking 8 figures minimum. We have the account number, the bank, the signatory. We have the proof." This was the first real piece of leverage I had, but it wasn't enough. An account number was one thing. Proving Marcus had intentionally hidden it during a legal disclosure was another. I needed to link him to it in a way he couldn't deny. I needed to get someone on the inside to confirm it. I thought of the name again. Jean-Luc Dubois. A direct approach was impossible. A man like that was trained to handle inquiries from angry spouses. But what about an indirect approach? I spent 2 days researching Dubois. I found his LinkedIn profile, his bank's corporate website. He was a senior vice president, a man who wouldn't be answering his own phone. But his assistant, a young woman named Celine, was listed in the corporate directory. These assistants were the gatekeepers, the repositories of all secrets. Using a voice-disguising app and a VoIP number that showed a Swiss country code, I made the call. I wasn't Amy Reed's scorned wife. I was Isabel, a junior associate from the Global Philanthropic Fund, a fictional organization I had invented on the spot. My tone was crisp, professional, and slightly rushed. "Bonjour, Céline," I said, my college French kicking in. "This is Isabel calling from the GPF in Brussels. We are in the final stages of vetting Mr. Marcus Reed for our foundation's Humanitarian of the Year award. It's a $50 million endowment, so our due diligence has to be meticulous. I have a quick verification question for Monsieur Dubois' files. It will only take a moment." The bait was set. The mention of a $50 million prize was designed to bypass protocol. Greed makes people careless. Celine was intrigued. "Of course, how can I help?" "Our records indicate a primary holding account for Mr. Reed under the entity Nightingale Equity. I just need to confirm the account number for our records." "Can you verify it ends in Ivera?" I had picked the last 3 digits from Ben's report. There was a pause and the soft clicking of a keyboard. "One moment. Yes, I see the account here. Nightingale Equity. And yes, the account number does end in 845. It is correct." "Excellent," I said, my voice betraying none of the triumphant scream that was echoing in my head. "Thank you for your time, Céline." "That's all we need." I hung up. I had it. A recorded phone call, perfectly legal, as I was a party to the conversation, with an employee of the bank confirming the existence of the account tied to Marcus's Shell Corporation. It was the second pillar of my case. And just as I saved the audio file, my phone buzzed with a Google alert I had set up for Marcus's name. It was a link to a new article in the Chicago Tribune, written by David Chen. The headline was explosive: "Questions raised over structural integrity of Pilsen Miracle Development. Sources allege falsified reports." The seed I had planted had taken root. The Tribune article was a bombshell. David Chen had done his job brilliantly. He hadn't printed my anonymous allegations directly. Instead, he'd used them as a starting point. He'd interviewed disgruntled former employees of Foundation Analytics, the second engineering firm. He'd found a city inspector who had been pressured to sign off on permits. He'd uncovered a pattern of Marcus's company, Reed Capital, using tactics to silence critics and bury inconvenient truths. The article didn't mention the buried geostability report by name. Chen hadn't found it yet. But it danced all around it, creating a cloud of suspicion so thick it was suffocating. The piece concluded by stating that the Cook County District Attorney's Office had opened a preliminary inquiry based on the allegations. Marcus's name was now tied to words like fraud, public endangerment, and cover-up. His phone must have been ringing off the hook. His carefully curated image as a civic-minded philanthropist and brilliant investor was beginning to crack. For the first time in our marriage, he was not in control of the narrative. The public nature of the scandal made him vulnerable in a way my private divorce proceedings never could. His investors would be getting nervous. His partners would be distancing themselves. The fortress was being besieged. His response was predictable. He went on the offensive. He released a statement through a high-priced crisis PR firm, calling the article a baseless smear campaign orchestrated by disgruntled business rivals. He threatened the Tribune with a defamation lawsuit. He projected an aura of absolute confidence, of righteous indignation. But I knew it was a bluff. He was rattled. I could picture him in his sterile St. Regis apartment, pacing like a caged animal, wondering where the attack had come from. And in his arrogance, he would never suspect it came from me. He still saw me as the docile, clueless wife, holed up in our brownstone, weeping into my wine. The idea that I could be the architect of this sophisticated, multi-pronged assault would be literally unthinkable to him. His lawyer, Donovan, certainly didn't think so. The tone of his calls to my attorney shifted. The smug condescension was replaced by a clipped, aggressive impatience. They filed a motion for an emergency settlement conference. They wanted to end this, to cauterize the wound of the divorce so Marcus could focus all his resources on the real threat, the public investigation. They doubled the initial settlement offer. It was still a fraction of what I was owed, but it was a clear sign of desperation. My lawyer, a shrewd, quiet woman named Helen, advised me to consider it. Amy, this is a good offer, a win. You could walk away now, be set for life, and let the DA's office handle the rest. No, I said, my voice firm. We're not settling. We're going to the conference. And we're going to reject the offer. Helen looked at me, a flicker of concern in her eyes. They'll see it as an act of war. They'll try to bury you in legal fees. They'll paint you as a bitter, greedy ex-wife. Let them, I said. I'm not after a settlement anymore, Helen. I'm after justice. I knew what I was doing. I was backing him into a corner. By refusing to settle, I was forcing a formal deposition, forcing him to legally disclose his assets under oath. He was already under public suspicion for one lie. He couldn't afford to be caught in another. His only move would be to lie again, to swear under penalty of perjury that the doctored financial statements he had presented were the whole truth. It was a perjury trap. And I knew his monumental ego would never allow him to believe that I, his discarded wife, could ever be smart enough to catch him in it. The week before the conference, I prepared my final weapon. I assembled everything into a single damning file. It contained Ben's independently sourced report detailing the Nightingale Equity Shell Corporation, the SWIFT codes and account numbers, the transcript and audio file of my phone call with Celine at the Swiss bank, and finally, a freshly printed copy of David Chen's front-page article from that morning's Tribune. A follow-up piece, this one with a devastating headline, Leaked Report Confirms Structural Risks in Reed Capital Development. Someone, it seemed, had anonymously mailed the geostability survey to Chen's office. I had, of course, worn gloves. The night before the conference, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark in my living room, the city lights of Chicago twinkling outside the window. For 15 years, I had loved Marcus Reed. I had celebrated his triumphs and soothed his failures. I had built my life around his, and I realized that the man I was about to destroy wasn't really the man I had married. That man had vanished years ago, replaced by a hollow shell of greed and arrogance. I wasn't seeking revenge on my husband. I was executing a judgment on a criminal. I felt no hatred, no anger, just a profound, sorrowful sense of purpose. I was an accountant, and the time had come to balance the books. The next morning I dressed carefully. Not in a power suit, but in a simple, elegant gray dress. I wanted to look calm, reasonable. I wanted to look like the woman they had so badly underestimated. I walked into that conference room on the 47th floor, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm, and sat down across from my husband for what I knew would be the last time. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. He just stared straight ahead, a mask of weary impatience on his face. He was ready to sign a check and make his little domestic problem go away so he could fight the real fires threatening to consume him. He had no idea that I was the one holding the matches. The air in the room was thick with tension. My lawyer, Helen, sat beside me, a stack of files in front of her. Across the vast, polished table, Marcus and Donovan looked like a king and his vizier, annoyed at having to entertain the pleas of a commoner. They radiated power and impatience. Donovan cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Let's not waste any more time," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have a war to fight on another front, thanks to some libelous garbage in the press. So, Mrs. Reed, my client is now prepared to offer a final one-time settlement of $10 million, plus the Lincoln Park residence. This is an extraordinarily generous offer, far exceeding what any court would award you. Take it. Sign the papers, and let us all move on with our lives." He slid the settlement agreement across the table. Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, a look of supreme confidence on his face. He truly believed he was in complete control, that this generous display of financial power would be the end of it. He believed he was buying my silence. I let the document sit there for a long moment, the silence stretching until it became uncomfortable. I didn't even look at it. Instead, I looked directly at Marcus, truly looked at him for the first time that day. There were new lines of stress around his mouth, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. The king was not as secure on his throne as he pretended. I gave him one last chance to come clean. "Before we discuss this," I said, my voice quiet but clear, "I have one question for you, Marcus. Are you certain that the financial disclosures you've provided to the court, the ones you will be attesting to under oath, represent 100% of the marital assets?" Donovan scoffed. "That question has been asked and answered. The disclosures are complete. We are attesting, under penalty of perjury, that they are accurate and total." He looked at Marcus, who gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "They are," Marcus said, his voice flat. That was it. The final lie. The door to the trap had just swung shut behind him. I took a deep breath. "In that case," I said, reaching into my leather tote bag, "you might want to look at this." I pulled out my simple manila folder and placed it gently on the table. It made a soft, unassuming sound on the polished wood. Donovan eyed it with suspicion. "What is that? More unsubstantiated claims?" "We're not interested in playing games, Mrs. Reed. It's just some light reading," I replied. I opened the folder and slid the first document across the table. It was the report from Ben's investigation, clearly detailing the Shell Corporation, Nightingale Equity, and its Panamanian parent company. Donovan picked it up, his brow furrowed. He scanned the first page, then the second. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not panic, not yet, but the first hint of professional alarm. This wasn't amateur hour. This was a detailed professional forensic report. Next, I slid a small digital voice recorder onto the table and pressed play. The room filled with the sound of my disguised French-accented voice, followed by the clear, helpful tones of Céline from the Swiss bank. "Yes, I see the account here. Nightingale Equity. And yes, the account number does end in 845. It is correct." I pressed stop. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched as the color drained from Marcus's face. His mask of arrogant boredom shattered, replaced by a stark, naked panic. He looked at Donovan, his eyes wide with disbelief and accusation. He finally understood. He had been flanked. Donovan's face had become a stony mask, but I could see the fury churning behind his eyes. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at his own client with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He had been lied to. He, a titan of family law, had been made a fool of by his own client, and was now complicit in committing perjury before the court. His career was flashing before his eyes. "And finally," I said, my voice barely a whisper, for context. I slid the last document across the table. The front page of that morning's Chicago Tribune. The headline about the leaked geological survey seemed to scream in the silent room. I had now linked Marcus's private lies to his public ones. It was a single, unified narrative of catastrophic fraud. I had given Donovan, a man whose only real loyalty was to his own reputation and law firm, the full picture. His client wasn't just a rich man hiding money from his wife. He was a reckless criminal facing a federal investigation who had just committed perjury with his own lawyer as a witness. Marcus was no longer an asset to Donovan. He was a liability, a contagion. The power in the room had not just shifted. It had undergone a quantum reversal. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't need to say another word. I had already won. Donovan slowly, deliberately took off his glasses. He polished them with a silk handkerchief, his movements precise and methodical, a man trying to control a seismic rage. He put them back on and looked at Marcus. "Get out," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "What?" Marcus stammered. "Get out of this room. Now, go wait in the reception area. Do not speak to anyone. Do not touch your phone. Just sit there until I come for you." Marcus, for the first time in his life, looked utterly broken. A puppet with his strings cut. He stood up, his movements clumsy, and walked out of the room without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me, my lawyer, and the man he had paid millions to protect him. Donovan stared at the file I had provided. "What do you want?" he asked, the question devoid of any bravado. The war was over. We were just negotiating the terms of his client's unconditional surrender. Months later, I was standing on the balcony of my new home, a penthouse apartment at the top of the Vista Tower, with a sprawling view of Millennium Park and the lake. The divorce had been settled in a flurry of silent, terrified activity. I got everything I'd asked for and more. Marcus's legal team hadn't negotiated. They had capitulated. Their only goal was to get my signature on an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and distance themselves from the train wreck of Marcus Reed. The criminal investigation, however, was just beginning. The Tribune articles, combined with anonymous tips to the SEC and the DA's office, tips that were remarkably detailed and accurate, had triggered a full-blown federal probe into Reed Capital. Indictments were imminent. Marcus was ruined. His assets were frozen, his partners had abandoned him, and his name had become a synonym for corporate malfeasance. Tabitha, the associate, had vanished from the scene the moment the first headline hit. I took a sip of my wine, a crisp Sancerre, and watched the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled. My phone buzzed on the small table beside me. I picked it up. A text from an unknown number. 3 words. "You will regret this." I stared at the message from my vanquished husband. There was no fear, no anger, no satisfaction. There was only a quiet finality, like closing a ledger. I held my finger over the screen for a moment, then deleted the message and blocked the number. He thought the money was his power, but he forgot that my power was the truth, and the truth doesn't need a hiding place. The end.